one of the people who's going to be at the table there in Egypt for the negotiations is Jared Kushner, Donald Trump's son-in-law. He was a big part of the first Trump administration, wasn't he? Sort of ever present, really, with Ivanka, his wife, Donald Trump's daughter. Up until this point, though, he's remained very much behind the scenes. Second time round, I've been speaking to the Times' Washington editor, Katy, who's been tracking the career of Jared Kushner and how the House of Kushner is back in Westminster, back in American politics. Katy began by telling me about about Jared Kushner's role in, just for context, the first Trump administration.
First off, he was an official advisor. He had an official role advising the president, and quite a wide-ranging brief. Justice reform. He appeared at a White House press briefing talking about COVID during the coronavirus lockdown period, and then also the Middle East and the Abraham Accords, which were one of the big achievements from the Donald Trump first term, is something that he was very closely involved in. Not to say it was all smooth sailing for Jared Kushner. He received a lot of attention, as did his wife, Ivanka Trump, who is, of course, Donald Trump's daughter and long rumored to be his favorite child in many ways. He's spent a lot of time praising her over the years. And they, when he won, decamped from New York to Washington, D.C. To really kind of boost the president. But I think soon discovered that while they were flying high in Manhattan, the rules of the game are quite different in Washington, D.C. And suddenly they faced, a lot of press scrutiny, various investigations. And Jared Kushner himself, I think in his memoir after he left, talked about, nothing could have prepared them for Washington, D.C. But perhaps the thing that hurt them the most was the most difficult was almost internal, backstabbing within the White House, really, of staff briefing against one another. So there wasn't that much surprise. I think Ivanka Trump had also talked about how politics is dark. When the Kushners on Trump returning to the White House made clear that they weren't going to be doing the same. They were not taking official roles. They were not moving back to Washington, D.C. But yet now, I think a few events in recent weeks show that while Jared Kushner may not have an official role, he is still very important to some of the things that the administration is focused on.
Yeah, okay, and we'll come back to that in a minute. In the meantime, he'd gone off and made an absolute truckload of money over the last couple of years, hasn't he?
Yes, so he started his own investment company soon after leaving the White House, and Forbes recently declared him a billionaire, which I think will tell you how that is going. When it came to that investment company, you have lots of Middle East investments. So Saudi Arabia is one of the countries where a lot of investment has come from. So some people pointing out, well, these are the countries that Jared Kushner dealt with when he was in the White House, and now he's doing them in a business sense. But in terms of, financing, he hasn't had much trouble getting it. And then, so I think Forbes, when they were declaring him a billionaire on the estimated wealth, was saying that they were putting it down to a combination of the backing from Middle East countries and then also some wise investments with that.
Okay, and that's interesting because, of course, it's relevant to the fact that he is now part of negotiations with Middle Eastern countries. You say that he's back in this sort of unofficial, sort of freelance diplomat kind of role, isn't he?
Exactly. So it's almost in the second term. I mean, we have seen in the second term Trump bringing family members once again into the fold. Now, you can say, Donald Trump Jr. has close links and so forth, but I think particularly on the world stage, Jared Kushner's father, Charles, he is the US ambassador to France. You have Tiffany Trump's husband. Tiffany Trump and her husband attend the state visit. Her husband's father, so Tiffany Trump's father-in-law, has just been given a role related to Africa, advising the president. So there are some official roles. Jared Kushner has no title here, but he is making waves. And I think in the week just gone by, first off, you saw him on Monday when you had the Israeli leader in the White House, and you had that press conference. The pictures behind the scenes of the White House released showed Jared Kushner holding court with, these very senior figures. And then, of course, we had the news just in the past few days that he is heading out to Egypt. We expect to be part of the talks on hostages and so forth. You start asking behind the scenes, and Jared Kushner has been working on a potential plan for Gaza for a long time now. He is the reason, or a large part of the reason, Tony Blair is involved. Jared Kushner and Tony Blair go back many years, a friendship that spans well over a decade. So in a way, all roads lead back to Jared Kushner and a lot of these Middle East plans that Donald Trump is now pushing as, what he hopes is building on the Abraham Accords, which Jared Kushner played a big role in. The difference being this time Jared Kushner has no official role, but perhaps is just as influential in this area as before.
Okay. What sort of relationship does he have with Steve Witkoff, the Middle East envoy?
I think they have a good working relationship, and technically it's Steve Witkoff in charge. But I think what they have in common is this sense of loyalty and long-standing links to Donald Trump, in the sense that Witkoff was, a real estate negotiator long before he was asked by Donald Trump to transfer those negotiations to Russia, the Middle East, any difficult conflict in the world. Jared Kushner's background is also real estate, but there are clearly people that the president trusts. There are also two figures in Kushner and Witkoff who I think are quite unconventional in their approach to foreign policy to a degree. So we know that, for example, Steve Witkoff has had a lot of briefing against him, which tends to seem to come obviously anonymous and so forth. But when you see how it is attributed from, the security base, the security establishment, they don't like the fact that he tends to travel quite solo, for example, doesn't always bring a negotiator, doesn't always check in with the embassy. They think there are checks and balances you have to have. Jared Kushner in his first term complained about, these Republicans who would say they were on board with Donald Trump's policy aims, but then when they tried something different to achieve it, such as tariffs, they say, oh, no, don't do that, just keep talking to them. So I think in the two men, because they're not creatures of Washington, D.C., or, government, or even long-term creatures of a political party, they come in a quite a different way of looking at things, which is one of the reasons they work together. Of course, the counter is some look on and say, well, this is all a bit unconventional. Where are the checks and balances? And of course, in the same week that we're talking about Jared Kushner and this peace deal, he's also been making news for helping broker a £50 billion deal related to video games and so forth, which involves a Saudi Arabia sovereign wealth fund. And you had a question in the White House briefing room this week from a New York Times reporter who said, why has the White House decided it's appropriate to have Jared Kushner involved in all these negotiations, given he's taken, a lot of money from some of the key countries involved? Now, Trump figures will say that's irrelevant. The point is he can pick up the phone and keep things going. But clearly, and there was a furious dismissal of the question by Caroline Leavitt, but it touches on one of the anxieties around this.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. And those kind of potential conflicts of interest, they sort of wore them quite heavy during the first term, didn't they? There was a lot more scrutiny over them. You point out in your piece that this second term feels very different in terms of that, in terms of how prepared they are to mix politics with business.
Exactly. And first off, in the first time, they were really bogged down by it. Now, you can argue they should be bogged down. It's not being dismissive of the conflicts of interest, but it was partly because lots of these figures were in official roles. Jared Kushner had to answer lots of questions. You also had to declare, things about your business's sources of income. Of course, if you're not actually in an official role, lots of those kind of checks no longer exist. But I think there's a more general thing. I was speaking to a few figures about it who covered the first term more closely than I did, having really moved to DC for the second term. And they were saying, why is it that people, when you have, for example, stories about, children of advisors and cryptocurrency, when you have, stories of ways that, potentially people are making money with links to the administration and, people can see what is publicly available there. Why is it that there isn't so much, press scrutiny or shock or so forth? And they're saying, well, perhaps actually there's just so much going on. And secondly, I think Donald Trump in the second term really looks back on the first term and thinks one of the things that went wrong were lots of the figures they had in their cabinet, their advisors, were not loyal enough to the president, and that created a dysfunctional White House. So therefore, having figures who are loyal might be a way forward. And then also, if you look at, for example, the Middle East trip earlier this year, where Donald Trump visited various countries, at lots of those places, obviously there was the Qatari gift with the plane, but generally speaking, there are business deals being signed all over the place. So I think that business and politics are just mixing a lot more in this second term, and perhaps because Trump believes it is working and he's in his second term, he's just pushing ahead. And I was speaking to some critics, for example, of Jared Kushner's past role in the first term. And they were saying, well, actually, it really depends what happens here. If you can say that Jared Kushner, through his mix of influence, contacts dating back to government, contacts through business, combination of business models, actually manages to bring forward a peace plan, perhaps people probably would look the other way for what they may otherwise see as conflicts of interests. So I think for some, how this all looks really depends on where you get to.
That is Katy Bowles, the Times' Washington editor. You can read more from her in your copy of the Times, or thetimes.com. You can read the full piece, actually, into Jared Kushner, the House of Kushner, his sort of politics, his business, how those two things are mixing, his place in the current administration. Thetimes.com is where to go.